You sail from Liverpool in 1750 with one mission: buy human beings on the coast of West Africa, sell them in the Caribbean, and come home richer than you left. That's the entire business model. Simple, brutal, and according to the merchants of Bristol and Liverpool, one of the most reliable ways to get rich in the British Empire. Except it wasn't reliable. It was one of the most volatile, most fragile financial gambles a man could make with his fortune, and most investors who tried it lost money or broke even at best. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what it costs to fit out a voyage like this, how the actual profit was calculated in pounds and pence per human life, why insurance turned this business into something even darker than the trade itself, and why a successful voyage in 1750 could still leave its investors poorer than when they started. Let's start with what it actually costs to get into this business. You don't build a slave ship from scratch most of the time. You buy or convert an existing merchant vessel, somewhere around 150 to 250 tons, and you fit it out for what the trade calls the outset. That means reinforcing the hold, building partitions below deck to maximize how many bodies you can fit, stocking provisions, hiring a crew, and loading goods to trade on the African coast: textiles, iron bars, guns, brandy, cowrie shells. Total outfitting cost for a mid-size voyage out of Bristol or Liverpool in this period runs around £4,000. In today's money, that's roughly £200,000 or around $250,000. You're sinking that entire sum into a single voyage you won't see a return on for 12 to 18 months, and you have no idea yet whether you'll come home rich or ruined. Here's what would surprise you. You'd assume the profit comes from the price you charge for a person once you sell them in Jamaica or Barbados. It doesn't. The actual money is made on the spread, what you pay for a person on the African coast versus what they sell for in the Caribbean. And that spread was thinner than the popular imagination assumes. You're buying a person for somewhere between 5 and 10 pounds in trade goods on the African coast. You're selling that same person in the Caribbean for 15 to 20 pounds after they survive the crossing. After you account for mortality, spoiled provisions, crew wages, and the interest on your borrowed capital, your real net profit per surviving captive sold lands somewhere around 10 to 20 pounds. Not per person taken aboard, per person who survives long enough to be sold. That distinction is the entire business model, and it's where everything starts to go wrong. Because the thing nobody tells you when you're calculating your expected return is the mortality rate. On average, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the people loaded onto your ship in Africa die before it reaches the Americas. Dysentery, smallpox, dehydration, the conditions below decks. Some voyages lost a third of everyone aboard. And here's the cold, mechanical truth of how 18th century merchants accounted for this on their ledgers. A dead captive wasn't a tragedy in the bookkeeping. It was a deduction, a line item. The entire accounting model of this trade was built around an assumed loss rate, the same way a modern shipping company budgets for breakage. That single sentence is the whole moral architecture of the business, written in an accounting ledger instead of a courtroom.
This is where it gets darker than even that, because by the 1780s, merchants had figured out how to turn that mortality risk into something you could insure against, the same way you'd insure a cargo of sugar or cotton against loss at sea. And in 1781, a ship called the Zong, owned by a Liverpool syndicate led by William Gregson, sailed from Accra carrying 442 captives, roughly twice what the ship could safely hold. Navigational errors put the ship off course. The crew claimed they were running low on drinking water. Over several days in late November, the crew threw more than 130 living people overboard into the Atlantic, not because they had died, because the owners had insured each captive's life as cargo, and a death by drowning during an emergency was a covered loss, while a death by disease or starvation was not. When the ship reached Jamaica, the owners filed an insurance claim for £30 per person thrown overboard. The insurers refused to pay, suspecting the whole thing was committed deliberately for the payout. So the owners took them to court. The case, Gregson versus Gilbert, actually went in the owners' favor in the first trial. The jury ruled that the killings were no different, legally, than if horses had been thrown overboard to save a sinking ship. It took an appeal and years of public pressure from abolitionists like Olaudah Equiano and Granville Sharp before the case became one of the sparks that helped end the British slave trade entirely in 1807. Insurance had turned mass murder into a line-item dispute over cargo loss. Now, even without that level of catastrophe, this was still a business that could bankrupt you through completely ordinary bad luck. Disease could sweep your hold and wipe out a third of your investment before you ever reached port. War could see your ship seized as a prize by a rival nation's navy, the way the Bristol-owned ship, simply named the Bristol, was captured by the French in 1758, taking its captives and its owners' entire investment with it. A slave revolt, which historians estimate happened on roughly 1 in every 10 voyages, could end with your ship burned, your crew killed, and your capital gone. And even your own crew was dying at rates close to 20% per voyage, from disease, from flogging, from the same uprisings, which meant you were paying out wages and replacing labor on both sides of the ship's hold.
So here's the actual math on a real voyage. Take the ship named the Africa, sailing out of Bristol in 1774, owned jointly by 8 investors. The fitting out cost was £1,247. Each of the 8 owners put in £711. After the voyage concluded, after selling the survivors in the Caribbean and bringing home whatever return cargo of sugar or rum they could secure, each owner received back £670. They got back less than they invested. That's not a hypothetical bad year. That's a documented voyage, on paper, in the account books. This was the reality across the whole industry by the second half of the century. In the early 1700s, a successful voyage could return 50 to 100% profit, extraordinary money for the era. By 1780, that average had collapsed to somewhere around 9 to 10%, only slightly better than government bonds, which were paying around 4%. You were taking on catastrophic risk of total loss, mass death, seizure, revolt, for a return that on average barely beat the safest investment available to a British gentleman who never left his house. So, if you're standing in Liverpool in 1750, deciding whether to put your fortune into this trade, here's what the 2 real outcomes look like. The optimistic version: your ship makes the crossing with minimal mortality, sells its survivors at a strong price, brings home a profitable return cargo, you double your £4,000 investment and walk away with £4,000 in profit, a genuine fortune for the time. The realistic version: disease takes a quarter of your human cargo. Prices in the Caribbean market are soft that season. Your return cargo is partial or lost entirely, and you get back less than you put in, like the owners of the Africa did, with your capital tied up for over a year for nothing. The slave trade promised the prospect of so great a profit, in the words of one Bristol merchant writing in 1745. What it actually delivered for most who tried it was a high-risk bet on human suffering that paid out worse than lending your money to the government and doing nothing at all.